All right, keys. What do you think about keys? What can we improve on with keys?
Oots Dragonflight is soon. Oh my goodness. Okay. Keys.
Yes.
There. That's the intro. Keys. I always have a weird relationship with keys. So they're not really for me. So like I feel like I have weird perspective and weird opinions sometimes. But uh I think Ian said in an interview he wants the loot from them to possibly be able to go higher and match raid loot better. And that seems like a cool idea for rewarding like higher uh, key pushing and stuff like that. We don't yet know how Great Vault is going to work. Um, the main thing for me that I've harped on this in the past, I think in one of the shows, and when I had a extremely like insane idea, is I don't like the weekly rotation of affixes that makes some weeks like actually played and some weeks not played. And then I also hate the keystone system where it's like random whether you even get a dungeon that you want to play or not, and it's random what level you can upgrade stuff to, or whether you and if you get a not favorable key, you deplete it, and then you can't push up a different key that you would be able to push higher. And I just hate the whole system. If I just want to be able to go in and do a key and try and do that key at a higher level, and if I don't do it, then I can try it again. And I feel like that just makes more sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a weird position with keys too, and I have a lot of different points to touch on, I guess. So the first one you talk about, like, well, having the right key is what's important, and pushing more recently, trying to push some keys up to get some rating has made me realize how awful that feels if you don't have the right key and you need to go do a dungeon that you don't care about to get the key that you want, or even just a chance at it, right?
Here's the weirdest. Okay, yes, it feels bad, but like, why? I guess is the best way to like. It's not like it feels bad. Like depleting a key feels bad, but it's like you had the opportunity to time it and you didn't, and it was like a skill check kind of thing. There's just nothing in your control at all that you can influence getting the right key or not. Like there's nothing where there was a skill check of like you should have done the key better to like make it the key you want. Like I feel like or like if you time a key, you should be able to choose what your key upgrades into or something, but if you don't time it, then it's random. Like I don't know. There can definitely be some sort of better system here than what it is currently. Basically, it doesn't have to be purely completely random out of your control. There should be some way to control it. If it's not just going to be you can go into any key you want at any level that you've completed, like or plus one higher, it I don't know, but you can still give some control over what your key turns into and upgrades into. I think.
Yeah, like I think a good example that can be problematic sometimes is like, let's say in this scenario, you've timed to 25 docks plus one to before. You have a 26 docks. You go do that, you time it, and then in order to get the upper that you now want to push upper cares in, let's just say, you would have to do a different key. And the other reasonable key that you have is another iron docks, where what that means is you'll do a 25 docks, even though you just timed a 26 one, just for the chance at getting it higher or into the like right key. That feels frustrating. There's a lot of just unique barriers in there that need to be given a more modern look, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And then you touched on eye level. I'm in a weird spot with it because I feel like if you equate, well, I don't know if you're saying this in particular, because let's just use current Shadowlands loot eye level for representation. If you make it Rio 4 eye level, what you can upgrade to, let's just say like they tack on some extra upgrade tiers for it, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you can do that, that's really cool for healers in the aspect that normally loot's given away. So we would actually be able to boost up just dungeon pieces to replace that and feel more comfortable about it, type of thing. Um, Although it does feel like it would diminish a lot of raid loot. Like the only thing that you'd really be interested in would be those unique like, trinkets and such. So like I'm thinking Orb of Torment off of Remnant. That was really cool to get. That was so unique as a trinket that you really wanted it. Um,
Hmm.
so
Well,
I don't know.
so I think there's two separate problems here kind of being combined. So I think if you're saying like the Mythic Plus loot upgrading to 304 invalidates the raid loot, I think that's fine if you're talking about like yeah, the Mythic Plus loot should come from Mythic Plus and be good in Mythic Plus or whatever. That should be a viable way to gear up your character. I think the part that you're kind of saying on top of that is you don't want the Mythic Plus loot to invalidate the raid loot for raiders, particularly, especially like healers where they might not get priority on loot and stuff like that. So I think in one sense it's good, and in one other sense it's bad. Um, but it kind of depends on the perspective or like the type of player or the main focus of that player, I guess. So I agree. I don't think it's just as simple as making the item level go higher. I think it needs probably some other consideration or differentiation between Mythic Plus loot and Raid loot. I don't know exactly what the best way to do that is, because like there's the PvP kind of solution where like the loot is lower level except in a certain category of content or whatever, and then it gets an item level boost. But I feel like that doesn't feel as rewarding, and I feel like it kind of makes like if you say Mythic Plus loot is only 304 inside of Mythic dungeons, I feel like that makes Mythic Plus like a lesser form of content compared to raid loot, where that raid item is just 304 everywhere, kind of. And I don't think they want it to feel lesser. It's kind of just a psychology thing, but I
Yeah,
don't know.
I
I
mean,
just have kind of vague feelings on like I agree it's not quite that simple, but I think it should be moved in that direction. And yeah, it will need some like further specific tweaks, but and I don't know what those should be exactly, but I think it should get closer to that than our current situation probably.
yeah, and it's interesting because I used a PvP a lot. I liked it, and I really liked the way that they took loot this time. Where in Shadowlands, having it like upgrade to an eye level in PvP worked super well. And then also the situation where, like, let's say tomorrow you and I want to try twos. Yeah, we'd probably suck, but the fact that we have high eye level pieces going in would kind of mitigate a little bit of the barrier to entry to the point
Mm-hmm.
that we could farm up enough to get the pieces we want, as opposed to going in at 239 eye level or something really low, right?
Right.
That's enjoyable, but
Is Conquest also uncapped now? Because I think that helps massively too.
I don't actually know. I remember they started with it capped, so it might be uncapped now. And people were like really frustrated the fact that Valor was uncapped, but Conquest
Yes.
was.
Right.
Uh,
I agree with that
but
being
speaking of
nonsense.
what that does, so I know this is a weird season, but what I'll say is like the idea of if you could upgrade it to if you could upgrade Dungeon Loot to Mythic Raid Eye level, what that's gonna do is now your sole focus for a lot of the raiders, especially in the situation of an uncapped valor, is you're going to focus on just getting dungeon loot. Like that's going to be a lot more the focus, kind of the way it was in this season, which
Mm-hmm.
I thought was fun. But what it did was it made you, uh, it took away from the end of the season, the same
Yeah,
way
the
that
longevity. Yeah.
yeah, the longevity of the season, but like to think about it right now. Now I have a ton of pieces that I want. I've got I mean, they added the Dinar system, all those little things. But if you make it so you can upgrade a piece to 304, people will hit an equivalent BIS really, really fast. Like I'm not saying like BIS, but I'm saying that you'll have, a 304 in the same slot that you'll be replacing with a 304, and so you won't feel as inclined to go work on it. Because personally,
Mm-hmm.
right now, the NAR system and all that stuff, I don't feel so inclined to keep doing dungeons. I know that I could technically get a 304 Mechagon ring. It's also like, expansions right behind the corner, and I know that we'll talk about that another time.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well, I also wonder, like, for example, right now, like a lot of times if you have a 304 in a slot, it's not really a meaningful difference what the secondaries are of that 304. But I think in a Dragonflight world, for example, they could try to move towards a world where, for most people, the secondaries do matter more against each other. So it wouldn't be the case where you just get a 304 and you're like, all right, close enough, I'm done. Where you would actually care about not just getting a 304 in the slot, but you would care about getting like the main one or two stats that you wanted on it. And like I know you do kind of care about that now, but it's to the point where like most of the time that's the difference of like 10 or 20 DPS or something. And I know healers it's not directly as comparable as that, but and they have their own stat weirdnesses sometimes, but they're not as like easily simmable to that level, but um yeah, I think maybe if that and the reasons they don't do that are they don't want people that are like in the know or whatever, or that do a ton of sims, to like super optimize their secondary stats and get a large disparity advantage over the casual player who just gets the 304 in whatever stat combinations in every slot. They want that to be as close as possible to the people that min max everything, and they don't like that having a big disparity between like the casual player and the super min max people. And so that's the reason they don't do that. And so I don't know what a good solution to that is to like keep the casual perspective like close in performance, but also make items matter at the same time. Like I feel like that was a weakness of the way the current system works is I no longer really care about specific items. I just care about the item level of the item. I don't really care about it having the exact specific stats anyway as much. So it made the
Interesting.
items all kind of homogenous with each other.
I think that's a good way for people to finalize their gear, though. Like I hear you about like, well, I have a 304 there, it's fine. The people that care a lot about it, they can work on getting a 304 of the right stats. That
Well,
would be a benefit, I guess I would say.
I agree with that. It would be a good way to like finalize your gear, but there's all these other systems that actually fight against that. So like for example, what if I have a 304 that has the wrong stats, but it rolled bleach or avoidance or speed
Yep. Yep.
compared to the other one? Or what if I have a socket currency and I use it on the 304 with the bad stats item, and then I get the 304 with the right stats item later, but now it doesn't have a socket? So like there's some systems that are like, oh, that would be the way to like optimize your character, but then there's these random other things or like lost sunk cost uh losses that you have to take where you have to then either refarm a socket or take or not take a great vault, I guess, slot to get the socket on the actual. So like there's weird things that are kind of contradictory with each other design wise that are fighting that from being the case, I feel like, where sometimes the actual way to optimize my character is to not chase those small optimizations anymore, which is wrong, I feel like. So
Yeah, loot in its entirety just kind of needs a good eye going into this expansion. And funny enough,
I I am fully on board with making sockets and leech and avoidance and speed more deterministic, and you could like farm them and you could get them on
mm,
exactly what slots you want in what combinations you want. I think that would be way better personally,
oh
but
yes, lovely, a Corthia farm so I can get leech on every piece. That would be
I did not
insane.
say a Corthia farm. Do not do not put that evil on me.
You heard it here first.
I
Rio prefers Corthia, but
Corthia was better than the Maw, I think, but not that great.
and
It took way too much time.
and to be fair, this concept of eye level for loot and such is something that they're looking at going into this expansion. The first thing we saw was the raid bosses in Dragonflight are not going to drop only two separate eye levels loot. Like for the first, well, in the example of Anduin, or I'm sorry, in the example of Sepulchre, up until Anduin, you'd have 304 loot drop, and then after Anduin, for those next three bosses, you'd have 311 loot. Well, now it's going to be like a slow scale, it seems, where boss one drops an eye level, a certain eye level, whatever it is. 2 through 4 drops like 3 or so higher. 5 and 6 drop a little bit higher than that, and 7, 8 drop the highest. Um, so I know you and I have alluded separately, but I'm interested kind of where Mythic Plus, the upgradable version, lands among all that. It would be really interesting to know, like, does it lie with the bosses that drop 5 and 6? That might be a happy medium where raid loot is still BIS from those last two bosses. Uh,
Yeah, I also think it matters where whatever the Great Vault equivalent is ends up also. I
yep.
think the upgradable part I don't think they would go to bosses like 5 and 6. I think it would more likely stop either just at the first boss level, maybe even lower than that, honestly. It might be 3 item levels lower than that. Or it would stop at like the 2, 3, 4. Um
Because there needs to
I
be,
don't really necessarily have a sense of like is the 2, 3, 4 better than the 1 versus better than the 3 below? Like there's probably pros and cons to each of them, but I don't feel like either of them really meaningfully change much of anything for me.
yeah. I don't know. I think it's one of those things where we'll have to have our biggest opinion following the raid itself and see how things went deep into farm too. Like all those things need to be factored in for their second season because they proposed changes. Let's kind of see how these changes roll, even though we don't know the full extent of the changes yet.
It's also weird because we now have crafted items at mythic item level like coming into the picture too.
Oh yeah, that's
So where are those going to end up? And like some of the materials for those I think are like only dropping from raid, for example, but like does that mean they'll drop from 15 plus mythic plus keys or something too, or just only from raid, or
yeah.
who knows?
Small detail or small detour, excuse me, into the details of professions. They are crazy. They have put a lot of effort into that, and I think it's awesome. I think uh it's one of those weird scenarios though where because you don't need like a legendary, you don't need to involve yourself in professions
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't want to. And not that you
Yep.
had to before, you could just buy the piece off the auction house. And same way here, you could do a work order for whatever BOE you want. And I think that's cool that like it's one of those systems where you don't have to engage in it. But there's a lot of benefits if you do. Like I already know that some people are trying to coordinate in our own group as to who's going to level what, just to make sure we have all the bases covered. But even then, you want multiple leather workers to
Mm-hmm.
specialize in certain things. Because I've gone on the beta, I've tested it out where you're given all the mats that you could possibly want up front, and you're able to like upgrade with all the knowledge and stuff. Because there's a mini talent system in it now too.
Yeah, it's
Not that there's
super
like
in depth.
there's not that much choice in the talent system. I would liken it almost to our current talent system in Shadowlands, where it's like pick one of three.
It's very, yeah, big picture direction kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. And I don't know. I think it was the only thing that's going to be bad about it, in my opinion, is you're going to want to go gung ho from day one. You're going to want to get far into whatever you can as fast as possible. For all the players that don't know what is best, they are setting themselves peaks behind other players because of their decisions, because of how vast that talent system is, that you could work super, super hard on being the guy that's the best at making male chest pieces. But if you didn't do a little bit of research, you would know that there's the highest eye level piece for that drops off of boss 6. And that boss is a joke, so it's no longer reasonable for you to make those, and they actually sell for a whole lot less. Like those things are going to be a little bit more punishing, I think. But I guess that was the case with legendaries too. Like people would
Mm-hmm.
work on making nail boots or something like that, but then funny enough, that's not what was best for a lot of classes, and maybe it was only for I don't know specifically MM hunters. And who plays MM hunter, right, Rio? So it's like I don't know.
Well, luckily enough, the same people that don't know what crafting is best also don't know what this slot is best for their legendary, and they bought the other version anyway. So like the demand was still there, and it wasn't like it was wasted completely. There was still a market for it. So I think it kind of works itself out. But yes, for me, the crafting system it's in a great middle ground of this seems like a cool thing that we'll be engaging to tinker with in the during the expansion, but it's not of such high importance that I need to know how it all works ahead of time. And so my current stance on it is like I'm getting some loose. I'm reading the headlines basically of the Wowhead posts of like of saying professions do some cool stuff now. Like you can get red loot item level, and I'm like cool. But then I have no idea how any of it works, and I'm gonna figure it out on the fly. Like once it actually releases, I'm kind of like avoiding spoilers of myself
Hmm.
for it because I'm gonna enjoy the tinkering with it, and I'm not like super worried about like making the max amount of profit from it or anything. So, um, for me, that's gonna be a fun part is actually kind of enjoying the figuring out of professions on my own kind of thing because it's something that allows me to do that because it's like it has importance but not super important.
Well, we as a
So
community are fairly blessed in the sense that in the competitive WoW subreddit, there's usually a post around the start of every season about like, Hey, here's exactly what you want to do every single day up until a minute, right? Like
yeah.
the Korthia example, I remember finding a sheet where it was like, this is everything you can possibly do for the day. This is where you should be at this certain point. I mean, it like trickled into Sepulchre where you saw like, yeah, so you will be exactly enlightened here if you do X, Y, and Z. Like, okay, I will have it in time for the raid that I need, right? Or relative to when everybody else will have it,
Mhm.
and just kind of go off of that. I think those are pretty cool. I'd be interested to see how much there is for Russians as opposed to people that want to hold that back and just make the profit. Um, we
Yeah, there is some weird stuff like that sometimes of hiding the trade secrets and cartels
yeah,
and whatnot. I enjoy that stuff. I mean, some people probably get very serious about it and take it seriously and get upset or like feel cheated out of it or something. But like to me, it's like that's the fun of video games almost is like you can just have a massively like messed up economy and like
yeah,
the ramifications on it are not important at all or serious to like anything, and so it's fun to just yeah, the economy's messed up, yep, capitalism is whatever, you know, this person held their secrets and made a monopoly and they made a cartel or something. I find that just like hilarious and fun, so yeah.
yeah. I I very much enjoy that portion of a new expansion. That concept of like, well, just go find the best way you can make gold. Like, I think my favorite way that I made gold was when Shadowlands launched. I found that the like arboreal shards, what you use to make the legendaries, like the pieces that were sold to other players, there was like an item that you'd buy off of a vendor, but if you were like revered or exalted with a certain faction, you could get it for cheaper in a different location. And so you could just buy up a whole bunch and sell them on the auction house, and nobody was the wiser. You could literally double whatever gold you were sinking in. So I was like taking, I don't know, I had 100K at the time. I dump it all into the shards, put it in the auction house, get 200K out, go do the exact same thing, and just keep churning it. Sounds like a drug scenario, but that's not what I'm trying to allude to. I'm just saying that it's fun at the start of an expansion to learn about the whole gold making aspects, kind of get caught in it like, oh, well, that one passed me by. I wasn't thinking about it. Maybe next time. Um,
The good news is when it passes you by, it usually means the thing has been like so massively exploited as so that it's
yes,
super cheap now.
yes,
So you get you don't get the benefit of making yourself rich off of it, but you get the benefit of the thing no longer costing a whole bunch. So
yes, exactly. Well, and I'm personally interested. I just kind of want to experience it with the group that we have right now. Like you got Lil G, our for those listening, our tank that likes to spend a lot of real life money on tokens, and he has a strong interest in maxing 6 professions day one type of thing. So I would love to ride that bandwagon and just get given pieces of loot for relatively cheap. I'm down for it. But I know we've taken a big detour. We were originally talking about the raid and eye level there.
we had professions nowhere on our topic
Yeah,
sheet.
that's true.
Oopsie.
But it's just too fun. If you have beta,
Yep.
I would highly advise just going to test it out, see what it's going to take for you to max your profession. Learn those aspects now so you don't make the mistake on live. My best advice. Um, but before the detour, we were talking about raids. And something unique this week is they're coming out with raid testing, and they're giving us a really big schedule this time. We are not being told a day or two before the actual testing is happening. We're being told about a week ahead of time, and then given the schedule for the whole month, or a month of time since then, essentially, or half a month, whatever. But this upcoming Thursday, they're testing 2 heroic bosses. It looks like the first two. And then They're going to test on Friday 3 more heroic bosses. Just to be clear, there's 8 bosses in the raid. They will not be testing the final boss at all, whether on normal, heroic, raid finder, any of that, it seems, supposedly. So we're gonna have 2 bosses on heroic that Thursday, 3 on Friday, and then they're doing a normal testing over the weekend. And I think that is just one of the best options they've given us. Is that if people aren't available during the week, but you still want to see what the boss looks like, maybe in a slightly less important setting, you can just hop in a normal, test things out, and it's over the whole weekend. Obviously, they'll make probably a few changes. I think a couple of times now when they've done these over the weekend changes, there's definitely been times where the realm is down, or
Hmm.
realms, I guess. So something to keep in mind if you have a very strict time schedule. But beyond that, uh, they've given us a list of what they're doing the week for October 7th, the week for the following one for October 13th, and following that. It's pretty cool. They intend to test all the bosses. They haven't determined some of them in the order they're specifically going to test them in. Um, Funny enough, they like so something to look at is like I said, Thursday testing 2, Friday they're testing 3 more. A week from that Friday, they are testing 2 more heroic bosses, but they've left them as marked boss to be determined, which is really interesting because there's only 2 other ones that they'd be testing. So
Yeah, well, they might repeat if they need to, if something breaks or they need to redesign something or whatever.
yeah, they definitely could add more onto it, but
'Cause they've done that in like Stone Legion Generals, for example. I think in Casanatria
yeah,
was tested. I think like 3 or 4 times the same boss
I did hear about that. Yeah. That
going into
was
Shadowlands. So
yeah. And
I I especially like the testing over the weekend thing because, like you were saying, for people that have time restrictions or are on a tight schedule or whatever, to me that's usually the most, I wouldn't say frustrating part, but like it does feel kind of lame. I guess is the best way I would describe it. For you to only have like 1 hour on a boss or something, you can't really play around with like different talent builds or different uh for Shadowlands, for example, different covenants or different um even different specs, is pretty difficult and things like that. Because you're only getting a handful of polls, and like some of the polls end pretty quickly or something, and you don't really get a feel for like how that specker situation or whatever setup plays in the fight yet, and things like that. So having a more just longer time period to test stuff where you could actually go in and say, hey, I want to try this talent build, especially because they're redoing all the talent builds. But and there's much more combinations of stuff now. uh but going in and being able to say, I want to test this build, I want to test that build, I want to test this spec, I want to test that spec, all on the same boss, and actually get a feel for like what feels good here, what feels good there, uh what stuff is playing well, what stuff is giving me issues and just feels clunky. I think part of this will lead into our later discussion, I guess, but um it's unfortunate that they're not having a design focus on specs as much going forward, and they haven't yet done the raid testing. I think it would be massively beneficial to see how this stuff is playing in raids and get that firsthand experience of actually playing with it, and then being able to give design feedback related to that. Not tuning, but just like the design of like, this feels clunky, this isn't playing out in practice, like that kind of stuff. And so I'm a little bit saddened that might not, that feedback from the raids might not actually really affect things too much going forward, because they kind of are mostly locked in probably already. But yeah.
yeah, I it is weird, and we will touch on that later. And the fact that realist what they're communicating is what they're just trying to test is if that bosses work. Doesn't seem like they have a large interest in the power level necessarily of some
I
of the classes. I feel like that might be something they focus more on the mythic testing.
Yeah, I do think they do adjust tuning based on the rate testing a lot of times, but I don't think it's solely based on rate testing. I think it's just one of the factors that plays into it a little bit. So
Well, and so it's our list of topics, but the concept of tier sets, right? Like we've we basically had to confirm that we are getting tier sets. They've designed the sets. We've heard on Max's stream from him talking with Blizzard employees that, they have been working on tier sets, and it sounds like we'll be hearing about them soon.
I think within
So,
the next week or two, yeah.
which is a little weird because that would entail us having tier sets for a portion of the testing. So, which is what makes me believe they care, at least in the heroic testing, they're testing the like mechanics. Does this work? Does that work? For the
Well,
mythic testing, they take it a bit more serious because that's when, I mean, yes, they'll take into account all tuning, but basically anybody can hop into heroic testing that has the beta. Mythic, if you're gonna actually get close to killing the boss, takes a bit more focus for sure. At least from my own
I'm
experience with it.
I'm not as concerned about having the tier sets available for testing. Now, I say this partially because when I did testing for like Sepulcher, my tier sets weren't working until after the patch had released. And so when we did raid testing, my tier sets weren't working already in the first place. So I've already experienced that world. And I don't know, you just figured out how the tier set worked after. Like, it wasn't that big a deal that you didn't have the tier set working. It just kind of was like, well, it just plays how it plays normally, and you just go off that as best you can.
Yeah.
I don't know. We haven't yet seen the tier set bonuses, so we don't know how radical they change things or not. Um, yeah, remains to be seen a lot on that. I mean, I agree. I think it obviously is lower quality or useful testing if you don't have the tier sets compared to if you do. Like, the expectation of what they're going to be balanced around and stuff is for you to have the tier set, and so it just kind of makes more sense to like have that be available if possible. But I'm not super concerned if you don't, and I
Yeah.
think they will have it for some of the later testing, like you said, for Mythic probably.
And I mean, we can kind of pivot to the readiness a little bit just because it's something that we touched on already. Do we think that the expansion will be ready? And quick spoiler, I guess you could jump ahead about 30 seconds if you want to, as to the release times. Um, it's supposedly going to have a 10/25 pre-patch, so October 25th, about a month from when this is being posted, and then an 11/28 release is the supposed one. Would not be surprised if there was a delay or anything like that, but that does not give you too much time left in this season 4, and I don't know where I stand on the readiness. They've already made a post that they are pivoting away from this design focus with regard to like the talents and the positioning, and they're moving on to the tuning phase. And I know you, Rio, had the thought that we might see like another pass at a couple of the designs just because it was something that might have already been in the works, right?
Yeah, I think they put out that post saying like going forward the design isn't going to be our main focus and stuff like that. But I think there has been changes that have been marinating in the background or something, uh, that are still in the pipeline, like to be shown to players, but have like from the design side perspective or whatever, they've been working on them for the past like few weeks or whatever. Um, so yeah, I think there's a few classes, a few specs that still probably would expect to see one or two more rounds of semi major changes to like at least moving talents around or like changing what a talent is or a capstone is and that type of stuff. Um,
Just
I don't think they're gonna do a delay. I think if they were gonna do a delay, they probably would have announced it by now, or they would have announced it very, very, very soon if they hadn't announced it by now. But based on like the design focus post, I don't think they're doing that for sure.
yeah, because just to clarify, they basically said that happy with where they got to, but that more could be done just over the course of the expansion. And I don't blame them for that. I think that I'd much prefer it that way than the same talent system we've had for a very, very long time where nothing changed. Like there were talents that have been dead for a really long time. So it's cool. It's something that they will be considering going forward, as opposed to
Yeah,
just saying, "All right, close enough to finished product. Here we go, send it." So
right. I've had multiple talent rows that had one selection the entire expansion for all forms of content, and you just never picked like two of them were just dead picks the entire time. and that felt really lame. And they never made any adjustments to even try to make the other options viable. Um, I don't know why that was the case. I would hope that they move away from that philosophy. Uh, I do think there's a difference though between something like not being tuned to a competitive level and something being like fundamentally design wise like broken or like flawed or contradictory or something. And so that's kind of where I have a disconnect where I don't think I would expect that they would do design level changes mid expansion. I don't think players expect that from them either. I think players mostly expect the mid expansion changes to just be tuning adjustments and stuff. But if there's some stuff that is like so, it's hard to say broken, but so I guess non-functional that the tuning adjustments would have to be so extreme for them to be like considered competitively, optional as a choice with each other and stuff like that. I feel like that's just it's much better to just invest the time and resources to fixing that stuff now because I feel like it'll only cause problems further down the line, and you get into like the tech debt kind of thing where like you're always chasing, trying to catch up to past issues, and you can't ever actually fully address them, and you have to let some of them go by the wayside and things like that. So I I'm very skeptical. Like I want to believe them, but at the same time, I just think it's better for the game if they I almost think it's better for the game if they get the design right and the tuning is more off going into the first tier compared to having the tuning be closer but the designs be less functional and less fun. Like at the end of the day, I want the specs to be fun to play. If the spec is super fun to play but it does like 5% less damage than other classes, like that's not that bad. And I think a lot of specs have enough of a population that they would keep similar like numbers of representation and stuff like that and popularity through that, even if they're doing 5% lower damage. But if a spec is not fun, like if it's not doing the best damage in the game, like nobody will play that spec. And if it is doing the best damage in the game, people will just hate playing it, but they'll feel forced into playing it. And so like neither situation is even good if the design is wrong. So I'm very worried. I The expansion itself I think will be ready. I think certain specs will not be ready. And maybe that just means that for example Hunter is just only going to play BM or survival and like they're not going to touch marksmanship until the first patch fixes it or something. And maybe Blizzard is okay with that. As a player, like is that the end of the world if you have two viable specs and the other spec is like kind of broken? It's not the end of the world. It doesn't like mean you can't play the class or anything. But like as a person that, for example, I love marksmanship. It's like my favorite spec. I often am in the case of I want to play MM over BM, even if they're like competitive or even with each other. Like I am definitely a marksmanship leaning person. And right now, I said this, I'm in the situation of I'm hoping that BM is the better spec tuning wise because I don't want to have to play marksmanship because it's not fun. And I don't want to have to say that. But right now I'm in the situation of wanting BM to be the tuned better spec so that yeah, and that shouldn't be the case. So that's what I'm mostly worried about. It.
Yeah, and there's the other side of the coin there, and I know that there weren't. I mean, there were definitely some scenarios like this, but just kind of think back to after it came out, right? Because it's like our best representation. Revival wasn't played at all, partially
Mm-hmm.
because of how strong the other hunter specs were. I think it's specifically marksman. So I don't think we're really necessarily straying too far away from the typical launch for an expansion, given all these changes. I agree, it'd be really nice if things could be tuned better, but we're also entering the tuning phase, and we kind of have to see where they come out on the other side of that to really
Mm-hmm.
judge them appropriately. Um, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it's the case that I can only interpret things through kind of like the tuning in my head or that I expect. And maybe I just have a bad sense of that. Like, there is a chance that I think the spec is fundamentally broken, and somehow Blizzard just does like a tuning pass on the numbers, and suddenly everything makes sense. Like, that is somehow in my head a possibility. I I don't see that personally, but I'm open to being wrong. I'm open to that being a possibility, and maybe I will change my mind or something. But so I agree. It's like on one hand, I feel like it's presumptuous to say like the spec is broken and needs like a minor rework and things like that, and maybe tuning can fix it. And it's just I need to see the tuning to really believe that. Um, but from where I'm sitting right now, I don't see that being likely, at least.
And yeah, it's kind of funny because like among all the changes they're making, they're giving a lot more raid buffs out and stuff like that. And being both a shaman and a hunter here on this
Mhm.
podcast, I feel like we kind of have to touch on that, especially because we're two of the three classes, if you add on DK, that are lacking these raid buffs. Kind of weird because like you could argue that we do have some things that make us pretty unique. Like in my case, I've got Spirit Link. In DK's case, they've got AMZ and grips that are like really good for that fight. You're getting the line of sight thing, I guess. I don't know if you want to talk about
I,
that, but
I, please, Blizzard, do not design raid bosses that have line of sight mechanics. I beg you. I don't want this utility. It's not fun. It doesn't make me feel good. It doesn't make the people that don't have it feel good. Like,
the
no,
thing that makes
don't
me
do
feel
this.
good is the leech you're gonna give me being in my party. But
Yep.
I,
Currently, we have party-wide leech buff, which means we're probably in the healer group because I guess leech is good for them. I don't know how healers work. I'm a hunter. Um, yeah. So some of this stuff is like we have utility, but based on Blizzard's like philosophy or whatever that they stated, I think Ian stated this in his interview. I think it was with Max, where he basically said, if you have 12 of the specs in your raid group already, we want you to have a reason to bring the last one. Um, at least one of each one, basically. And so a lot of people have suggested, like in the past, Hunter had through their pets a way that they could basically bring a copied version of all the other buffs. So they could bring a pet
yeah,
that brings Mark of the Wild or a pet that brings Arcane Intellect. But and that's certainly better than the situation where we are right now, where we don't have that at all. However, in a situation where you have the other 12 classes already, at that point, bringing the 13th Hunter, there is no compelling reason that you need to bring the 13th Hunter because he's not giving you a raid buff that you don't have. He's just giving you a duplicate of one you do have. I personally, I I just am at odds with the raid buff kind of philosophy where you have 13 classes in the game. There are 20 spots in a mythic raid group, which is what they like balance everything around basically for PvE. And if you have raid buffs on 13 things into 20, you can't have two of all of those, right? That number adds up to 26, which means some buffs inevitably only have one person in your raid group as like the representative of their raid buff or whatever. And if that person is ever absent or gone or unavailable or whatever, your comp now just loses like a very important, meaningful buff. That just feels bad. So like the math just doesn't work out. You can't have 13 into 20 and have it be fun. I feel like the whole philosophy is kind of just flawed from the start. Um, I feel like there's different ways to make every class wanted to be in raid that isn't necessarily a buff like this. I think more duplicates of stuff is probably better. Like I said in the past, I suggested that you have a couple scrolls where you could have similar to the hunter pet system, but you could say, okay, our mage isn't available this day. Now instead of losing arcane intellect, we just use a scroll of arcane intellect and we still get his buff. And the comp is like okay with not having one or two classes in the raid, but there should be reason where if you have the mage available, you probably want to bring them in rather than using the scroll, if that makes sense. So like, I don't know. It's tough. People like it's frustrating that we've gone so many iterations of and gotten so many hunter blue posts and still no hunter like raid buff existence thing, even though they've like been discussing it for 2 months now, and I don't feel like it's that hard to come up with something. I've suggested making a nature damage buff similar to like the havoc mystic or the I guess demon hunter mystic touch or the the monk brand or whatever, chaos brand. Those are the wrong classes in
Swapped them.
association. Flip
Yep,
flip
yep.
those,
All
yeah.
good. All good.
But like so, and it would be a similar thing to like, okay, melee specs have like the Wind Fury thing or like Battle Show for like attack power, but a nature damage buff would buff like elemental and enhancement shamans plus boomkins plus hunters, and that's like our own little weird niche clump buff that buffs us. Whereas I don't know, that was my idea, just to give a random thing, just to like have something. I came up with the idea in 5 seconds. It's probably not perfect, but it's better than nothing, right? Like it. I don't know. Just do that. Just put that as a placeholder or something. So I don't know. I don't get what's so hard to come up with something, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be. It just has to exist. Really, that's that's the bare minimum that we've set for ourselves that we would be happy with. And so yeah, I don't know.
I think a good summary, basically, of what you're saying is that we're we're in this position where it's a little weird because they've made the commitment. They're like, okay, we want to have a reason you bring a different class or every single class to your group, and in their mind, some of the ones that they've provided for some of the classes aren't as strong as they may think. So they're under the impression, yeah, you'll see the full rainbow. You'll see all 13 classes in this upcoming raid. And maybe their point of view is like, well, maybe not on every boss. It's kind of like if we're gonna dip our toes in this way, where we're giving out more raid buffs, where evokers now have lust. You've got paladins that have res. Granted,
Dude,
it costs
Evoker's
holy
got
power.
everything, man.
Yeah, they got everything, but they also didn't get everything. So we'll talk about that another time or maybe in a bit. But my
Except
point
range,
being,
yep.
yeah, except the range. Yeah, they got 5 yards of range more than before, which
Uh,
equates to like a 13% more coverage. I don't know. Anyways, my point being, if they're going to put their feet in the pool of let's give everybody raid buffs, then I'm gonna push you off the diving board. Let's make sure that everybody has it at that very least, right? So,
yeah, it's their own stated goal. If you told me the goal was some classes are gonna have raid buffs, some classes aren't gonna have raid buffs, but we're gonna like tune it to make sure that like hunters aren't the lowest DPS class, so that you'll still want to bring them for raids and they'll be good on certain fights, they'll be good in execute, like you'll want to have them in your raid. If that was like your goal and you told me up front, like, hey, we're not planning to design this for everybody, like, okay, that's fine. I can believe that. I might not trust it entirely, but you can at least like we can say then going in like, okay, Sims are coming out this next raid tier. Hunters are looking pretty low. Like, hey, hunters need a buff, Blizzard. You know, like we can tailor our feedback to that. But when you tell me we want there to be a reason for you to bring every class to the raid, and then you do nothing to like make that to match your own stated goal, like I don't understand. Do they want us to just keep asking? Like, I don't know. How can I give feedback to that? Where I'm just like, hey, we're still waiting. Any time now would be good. You know,
yeah,
like I don't know. I don't know how to like help this move along and
I'm
get better.
I'm not a fan of like leaving up to tuning because in a given tier where it's not spot on or something like that, then you've got big problems, bigger problems
Yeah,
than before.
I think you
But
should plan for you to be able to make mistakes. Like you shouldn't need to get tuning perfect in every single tier for the like the classes and comps to like be fun for everybody and make sense and everybody feel like they're going to be represented and have reason to want to be brought and not be benched, stuff like that. Like you should be able to have some margin for error and everything still be okay. I think that's just smart.
yep, I just one of those things where we can be hopeful going in. We can only really have our opinions coming out of it as to how things played out. Um, Another thing that we know some details about are the dungeons coming up. So I know we've kind of pivoted back and forth between raid and dungeons, so what? But taking a look at the dungeons, we know the four Dragonflight that it's going to be, or that come with the expansion. The Ruby Life Pools, Algathar Academy, No Could Offensive. I definitely said that wrong. And the Azure Vault. I think I've only done the offensive one before.
Is that
Um,
the one where you fly dragon riding around the entire zone?
well, if it is the one where you fly around dragon riding, I would be wrong. I'm thinking of the one that was like on a beach With a bunch
That's
of
like the
murlocs.
Anatherin Plains or something,
Hmm.
I think.
Well, crap. I don't know any of these dungeons then. Good question.
No, I'm saying the dragon riding one is the Plains. So I think the offensive one
Oh,
is not that.
Silly Hunter. Yeah,
So I
definitely
so I
right.
think
So I don't
I
know.
think you are correct.
I'm in a weird spot. I need to do these dungeons to have a better opinion on them, but we do know the ones that are returning, and those are a bit more troublesome in some people's opinions. So we're bringing back Fort of Stars, Temple of the Jade Serpent, Halls of Valor, and the Shadow Moon Burial Ground. So the Shadow Moon and well, I know I have definitely tested Shadow Moon Burial Grounds just on time walking.
Hmm.
You said that for the Temple of Jade Serpent, they're actually removing a boss because it was like timer specific or something like that, where it would last a very set amount of time. That just
Yeah.
isn't going to work in
There's a
their format,
there's
I
a
guess.
term for it. It's been on the tip of my tongue the whole night, and I can't remember what the term for it is. But
Ah, okay.
it's like it has an automatic length of time that it will always take.
Gotcha. All right. Set in stone.
Yes.
But I don't know. I think I'm in this similar boat where I didn't know what it was going to be like to have Iron Docks, to have two Karazhan dungeons, to have Grimrail Depot return, uh, that we would actually be able to pull. Mechagon dungeons I knew a lot about, that type of thing. I'm in a weird spot because I felt like I was fairly judgmental going in. Uh, the community, while they voted for those, didn't really seem to be super happy about the fact that those were the voted ones. I understand having pulled those dungeons why they're not the case. And it's also the point where in the season, I don't like, yeah, I might be pushing a little bit here and there, so I will do those dungeons. But when I'm thinking about my weekly 15s, if it's not a gambit or if it's not a junkyard, I'm probably not having as much fun. And the fact
Yes.
that there's like a range where there's like the easier dungeons and the harder dungeons at 15 specifically, I don't know if I
Well,
like that. I would
it's
have,
also not just easier and harder, but it's also like shorter versus longer. Like some dungeons are closer to like 40 minutes and some are like closer to
yes,
like
yes.
25 to 30. So, yeah.
Yeah, the speed is definitely a factor as well, but it's also like I think to myself, I don't know, I feel like Workshop has the chance to be relatively quick. It's just like what's difficult in that dungeon when messed up is really, really bad, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
So I think to myself with like the difficulty of the dungeon specifically, a lot of people know Gambit. You could mess up Gambit and there's portals that bring you back ahead.
Yeah,
It's
I was gonna
perfectly
say
fine.
I feel like the wipe recovery is like almost a very important factor too, where it's like, is it possible to like mess up a pole or a boss and not ruin the whole key,
Yeah,
basically, and
yeah.
like you can get back into it very quickly or reasonably without maybe needing to like wait for lust or like need to get uh I don't know, certain a buff stolen, spell stolen from a mob, or like I don't know, some weird stuff that like happens in dungeons sometimes. So
Yeah,
yeah, I feel like that makes a big difference.
my point being is like if I go into a pug and the pugs aren't doing super well in the key, that's fine. In a gambit, you'll probably still plus two it. In a junkyard, if you don't plus three it, you're definitely doing something wrong. But you know, I would not be surprised if I went into a lower. People weren't even playing that bad, but they just didn't know too much about the mechanics, something like that, or like an upper. If they're not kicking on the Medivh boss, or they don't know what to kick, it makes that boss entirely too difficult. I'm just in that position where it's like the range of dungeons felt pretty severe this time around. Um, I kind of want to see if they do anything about that in season one for Dragonflight. I know that they did a lot of tuning for like the Karazhan dungeons in particular this time around. Felt like some of that was a little too late for when it came. The fact that they were like still iterating on it
I was gonna say
for a
almost
while in.
every single week we've gotten more lower Karazhan nerfs. It's a
Yeah,
weekly ritual at this point.
and the fact that it was like week one, if you did a 15 Karazhan, it was like wow, nice. It's like oh my gosh,
It was
that tough of a
I
dungeon.
I I feel like week one it was like the equivalent of like a 23 key or something. Like
Maybe, maybe. Yeah, but the way that it was like tuned and fact that people
Yeah.
didn't know the dungeon, and I don't know. That's another point. Is like I feel like the concept of preparing a random pug for a dungeon needs to be better. The gap in knowledge between the higher end of the community and the lower end is pretty large. Like I think to myself about the amount of time that I invested teaching my friend that's like learning how to tank into how to tank these keys. That was a lot of time. And it's also all going away in a bit because it's gonna be 8 new dungeons. That's fine and all, but my point being it's like that's that's a pretty big leap, and it's also causing a lot of issues among the community that needs to bug and stuff like that. You know?
This could be a whole separate topic, but
It could. It
I
could.
I think over time dungeons have definitely gotten more complex, and you've needed to know a lot more. Um, I'm especially worried for the dungeons being brought back. Court of Stars, I think they have a little bit better chance because they did it with the Legion time walking semi recently with the Legion. I should say the Legion time walking Mythic Plus specifically, beyond the regular time walking stuff. I think the older dungeons seem to be more uh have a higher likelihood of being needing tuning adjustments and things like that. They're coming out uh either with bugs on bosses or just not being built for affixes. I think of stuff like the Iron Docks, like quaking, wiping your entire group the first week or two, stuff like that. And so I think they really should test these older dungeons in Mythic Plus a lot going in and make sure that they're good so that hopefully they don't need as much adjustment as like the Karazans did, for example. Um, the Mechagons I felt like were pretty good. I don't think they've received a whole lot of changes.
A little bit,
Um,
but they were very
but
good.
they're
Yeah.
but they're more recent dungeons and they were built like in the Mythic Plus era of the game and stuff like that with seasonal affixes and stuff like that too. So um, yeah, I just think the older the older back the dungeons are, I think they just require a bit more attention and care to make sure that they'll be good going in. But I do think they are a little bit mechanically simpler, but oftentimes that's counteracted by the just sheer numbers like throughput damage that they do being a lot higher, I feel like. And so that's why it's tricky to balance those where you go in the first week and some of that stuff just does so much damage. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Like a good example was, I think Grimrail Depot. Right. That's one where you get to a high key stuff, chunks, right? Just in general, and the point that on the last boss you had to come up with some like standing off the side strategy to
safe spots,
ensure
yeah.
that you didn't touch the lightning that would come down that um
It
you
had
couldn't
no
plan
indicator.
for. Yeah,
Yep.
no indicator. So it's like if you do get hit, you're just dead. And that didn't matter back when that dungeon was real because it wasn't like Mythic Plus was a thing, really, right? When that
Mm-hmm.
was the case, it was still like challenge modes in WoD. So I don't know. I think it just needs to be focused on a bit more than they have in the past. Maybe I would almost be in favor of them releasing Mythic Plus in a format where they focus on a specific dungeon. They say here, kind of just I'm sorry, just like raid
Ooh.
testing.
Yeah,
Go
no, I
test
think
out
that's a
any key
great
level
idea.
you want. Yeah. Tell us what worked, what didn't. And the problem is like they have to be able to weed out the important stuff. Like people that are going to go try to do 28s or whatever, and they're like, oh, I still died. It's like, okay, we'll play better. But that what portion of that wasn't something that should be outplayed, you know?
Yeah, I think they probably, if I were them, I would have a certain kind of internal metric of like, we expect people going in with this item level in this kind of like pug setup or whatever versus a pre-made group to have this like chance of success or whatever in completing the dungeon at 15 versus at 20 versus at 10 versus at 5, you know, like just have kind of pre uh preset like breakpoint metrics or whatever that you're expecting people to hit and adjust accordingly. Like if it's scaling too hard with key level or something, figure out some ways to adjust that if it's too hard on tyrannical versus fortified, or too hard um, just in general across the board, or like lengthen the time rate. They can have different ways of adjusting that stuff, but I'm sure they do have some sort of internal metrics that they can uh, adjust things by. So I know in the community they've developed their own metrics based on what limited available API information we have and stuff, and so you can see the difference of like how many people, like you said, are running Gambit and Junkyard versus how many lower Karazans get run
Yeah. Yeah.
in a given season or a given week. And so I'm sure even with just that basic, very rudimentary, like primitive data, that you could still glean a lot of information that you could say we should probably take a look at that. So
All all very good considerations going forward. Either way, I'm looking forward to Dragonflight. Not like a
I feel like it's coming like so much sooner than I was expecting. Like it feels so close now. Crazy.
yeah. I I mean we know it's in 2022 and
Yeah.
technically there's only 3 months left. So
I guess I feel
barring
like season 4 is going by pretty quickly.
yeah, I don't think that's the worst thing. I think with how fast we got gear and all that, it's coming to a close on its own pretty quick. So I don't know. I'm happy the direction that the game is heading, at least for the time being, and looking forward to seeing the changes they make. And hopefully, for some of the listeners, you guys can hop into our heroic raid group this Thursday because we need people. You have beta. Woo.
I do want to say one thing at the end, which is the blue post that they made on the design focus regarding classes and talent trees and stuff like that. I massively appreciate that they made that communication, and I think it is good. I like I said, or like you said, the philosophy and the direction the game is headed in. I like that they're being more open with communication about stuff like that. Even though people have, or by people I mean me, and maybe it's too, have a bit of a negative reaction to that, seeing that post and things like that. I think the overall trend of like communication and uh, open back and forth with the community, and like bringing them into saying like this is what our plans are ahead of time and things like that has been massively beneficial overall. So yeah.
Absolutely. I guess the last thing I will touch on then is there's a very high chance that this next episode, I guess episode 9, will be streamed live with webcams. So if you miss it, your problem.
Well, we can still record it after and
We
upload it
could.
later.
I'm not saying we can't, but you want to see it live. I don't know where to. I guess it would be on my stream, huh?
I don't know. We could make a new Twitch channel for it if we wanted.
Potentially. Look in the comments. I don't know. Maybe I'll post something there. If not, go scour the internet.